What's going on, everybody? In this video, I'm going to explain how to translate the insight you obtained from a scenario planning exercise into a strategy for your organization. And this is perhaps the most important video I've done so far, because unfortunately, a lot of foresight work done in organizations stops at the scenario stage, while in reality, scenarios, after they have been created, have to be used to change or improve strategy, and that is difficult. In fact, the idea to use scenarios to reconfigure strategy is considered by many one of the most problematic, if not the most problematic part of foresight practice. Now, that of course could be for many reasons, including the lack of appropriate communication between the scenario team and the right level of management, the halting of monetary resources during the scenario planning process, limits of time, and so on. But most of times, it is actually due to an inherent lack of structure or methodological rigor to do that. So in this particular video, I'm going to tackle that methodological aspect. I'm going to share with you 3 methods that I think are great to translate scenarios into strategy. I'm going to share with you the strengths and limitations of each method, and finally, I'm going to tell you my point of view on all of this. A few disclaimers before we start. First, everything I say in this video is evidence-based, and I will paste all the references I've used to create this video in the description box down below. If what I'm going to say is not evidence-based, I will tell you beforehand. Second, in this video, I assume you have already created a set of scenarios, and I specifically focus on what you should do after that. If you're actually more interested to know more about scanning the environment for driving forces or creating scenario narratives, I suggest you take a look at other videos I have already created on those subjects. Third, in the language and examples I use in this video, I consider scenarios done in corporate organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that the techniques I'm going to share with you cannot be applied to governmental foresight. In fact, in that case, scenarios have to be translated into policies rather than into strategies, while the techniques I'm going to share with you stay roughly the same. But just allow me to do that for language simplicity. So let's jump right in. The first method to translate scenarios into strategies that I want to share with you is called scenario immersion. This method was introduced by Wilson and Ralston of the Stanford Research Institute in their book Scenario Planning Handbook. Let's take a closer look at what this method is about.
In this method, the scenarios are presented to as many organizational members as possible in a workshop format. Then, for each scenario, each individual in the group is asked to identify as many threats and opportunities that that scenario presents for the organization without any concern for their probability, and to write them down on sticky notes. This could take several rounds and is done until no new threats and opportunities are found. Then, the workshop facilitator may cluster the sticky notes in similar groups or ask the organizational members to do that, and this is to reduce the total number of sticky notes. Finally, the remaining sticky notes are placed where everyone can see them in the workshop room, and each member of the group is asked to act like decision maker and identify strategic responses to those threats and opportunities. These responses will be the basis of a strategic plan.
So as you can imagine, this method is really good because it allows an organization to deepen the scenarios and to better understand their implications. Moreover, it is also very good because it allows us to gather a great amount of feedback to the scenario planning exercise, a full spectrum of ideas, in the form of potentially 30 to even 50 sticky notes that can be useful for decision making. However, the downside of this technique is that the strategies contained in those sticky notes might not be implementable because they're not created by the management that is fully aware of the sunk costs and previous plans that are inherently constraining an organization. In other words, a limitation of this technique is that it is rather disconnected to the company's strategic past, which leads us to the second method I want to share with you. The second method I want to share with you to translate scenarios into strategy is called wind tunneling. This method was introduced by Kees van der Heyden, the former director and co-founder of the Global Business Network, a scenario planning consultancy, and also part of the former scenario team at Shell. This method was introduced in several journal articles and in his book, Scenarios: The Art of Strategic Conversation. Let's take a closer look at what this method is about.
The name of this method, wind tunneling, is a metaphor that takes after the wind tunnel an instrument used in vehicle engineering to test whether new vehicles' prototypes can withstand different highly erratic conditions of the atmospheric environment, such as strong winds, strong snow, etc. In the corresponding foresight method, the strong environmental conditions stand for the different conditions in the external environment presented in each scenario, while the vehicle stands for the pre-existing strategies of the organization. This method successfully takes into account an organization's pre-existing strategies before a scenario planning exercise because it uses a so-called wind tunneling table to stress test all pre-existing strategies such as marketing strategy, research and development strategy, and so on, placed in the rows, against each scenario placed in the columns. This means that, similarly to the original wind tunnel instrument in vehicle engineering, the pre-existing strategies are to be evaluated against the strong conditions of each scenario. If they can resist them, they are robust and can be retained. If not, they have to be redesigned or done away with.
So by connecting the organization's strategic past with the scenario planning exercise, this method is really useful because it allows us to pinpoint which pre-existing strategies are actually not going to be viable in the future, which is something that scenario immersion cannot do, and thus to focus the management attention on what's actually important, that is, those strategies that are actually robust under all scenarios. Moreover, this method is very flexible. In fact, not only can you use wind tunneling to test pre-existing strategies of your organization against scenarios, but you can also use it to test competitor strategies, new business ideas or models, and even core capabilities of your organization against scenarios. In sum, this method is really good because it allows us to refocus the management attention as a consequence of a scenario planning exercise. However, this method has one limitation, that is, whenever we are judging whether strategies are robust under future scenarios, we are really evaluating their performance given a set of objectives of an organization in a rather arbitrary manner. For example, say that you have more than one strategy and you need to decide which one to keep and which ones to do away with. Well, in that case, the evaluation can be rather approximate and misleading, which leads us to the third method I want to share with you. The third and last method to translate scenarios into strategy that I want to share with you is basically an unnamed variation of wind tunneling introduced by George Wright of Strathclyde University and George Cairns of RMIT Australia in their book Scenario Thinking: Practical Approaches to the Future. This method is used when we have competing strategies and we want to decide which one to keep. In this method, competing strategies are tested against scenarios in view of a set of objectives of an organization to determine the best strategy possible. Now, this requires an example.
Suppose that, for simplicity, you have two scenarios. Then suppose you have two objectives, and that could be a certain market share of an industry or a certain level of customer satisfaction. Now, further suppose that you also have three competing strategies. For example, let's call them expand, differentiate, and partner up. And that you have to decide which one to keep and which ones to do away with. Then the method consists in 3 steps. In the first step, for each objective, we rank each strategy against the 2 scenarios from best to worst. This effectively compares with scores the performance of each strategy in view of the objectives in each scenario.
For example, in what you see here, for the market share objective, the expand strategy performs better in scenario 2 rather than in scenario 1. The differentiate strategy also performs better in scenario 2 rather than in scenario 1. But the partner up strategy actually performs better in scenario 1 rather than in scenario 2.
In the second step, for each objective, we rank all strategy scenario combinations from best to worst. This effectively compares the strategy in scenario performance of all strategies between each other across all scenarios.
For example, in what you see here, for the market share objective, the best strategy in scenario performance is the expand strategy in scenario 1. The second to best is the partner up strategy in scenario 2. The third to best is the expand strategy in scenario 2, and so on. Finally, in the third step, for each strategy, we look at the scores obtained in step 1 and 2 for all objectives. We can even sum them up to determine the best possible strategy, which will have the lowest score. So this method uses quantification to provide a more objective insight when an organization needs to decide between competing strategies. But of course, a limitation of this technique is that it overlooks the qualitative elements of strategies or the relative importance of each objective. And we could argue that even if we tried to include those elements by giving weight to scores accordingly, that would still be an excessive reduction of an otherwise rather complex strategic problem, which is difficult to untangle with numbers. Okay, so now that we know all the major methods to translate scenarios into strategy, their strengths and their limitations, let me tell you what I think about all this. Well, first, I have chosen these methods for two reasons. The first reason is that they are very structured. In fact, I believe it is not enough to ask what are the implications of a set of scenarios. We need to have a structure to do that. And secondly, I believe these three methods are rather complementary. In fact, in an ideal case, if you have enough resources, it would be ideal if you could do some form of scenario immersion to better understand the implication of the scenarios. It would be also ideal if you could use wind tunneling to test pre-existing strategies against scenarios. And you could even combine scenario immersion with wind tunneling, testing the strategies you came up with in scenario immersion using the wind tunneling table. And finally, it would be ideal if you could use the wind tunneling variation I just mentioned in case you have to decide between competing strategies. Now, if you cannot do all that, I still suggest you at least do some form of wind tunneling. In fact, any organization has some pre-existing strategies, and wind tunneling is a great and flexible tool to see the blind spots of those strategies and the way forward as a consequence of scenario planning. Now, that of course doesn't apply to those cases when you're just starting a venture, in which case scenario immersion might be your best pick to actually identify strategies from scratch. Anyway, no matter what method you use, at the end of the day you will have a set of remaining strategic options that seem to be the most appropriate. Now, before going to implement those options, it is also super important to make sure that those options are aligned between each other in a coordinated strategic whole.
To visualize this alignment and as a final step to connect scenarios to strategy, it is actually super useful to redraw either the value chain or the flowchart of the organization after the wind tunneling exercise. This drawing will then circulate to the right level of management along with the report containing the deliverable of the scenarios.
Finally, I want to make it clear that the methods I share with you are just what I believe is the best out there in the futures and foresight literature to translate scenarios into strategy. For sure, there are other methods, and for sure they're very useful if you know how to use them. So if you like this video, I would super appreciate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will have many more videos about futures and foresight coming up in the future. Ciao!